They would talk about homosexuality. They talked about decentralizing the church. They talked about women deaconesses, the ordination of married men. They don't want to leave the church. They don't want even to cause a schism in the church, as far as I can tell. According to their best theorists, they want to stay in the church and they want to weaponize time in such a way that they completely take over the institution.
Hey, I'm Jim Havens. Good to meet you. I host a radio show called The Simple Truth, where we pursue the good, true, and beautiful and proclaim the life-giving reality of Jesus and his Catholic Church. Stick around. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
To begin, can you share a bit of your personal backstory that led you to the writing of this book?
Around 2016, I just became really fascinated with this pontificate. This was around the time when Amoris Laetitia had come out, and there was that whole controversy about communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. I just began really investigating what was going on in this pontificate. And not too much after that, the book The Dictator Pope came out by Henry Sear, and his first chapter was called The St Gallen Mafia. And I read that chapter up to the point where they talked about the leader, Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, and I was just so fascinated that I temporarily put the book down and downloaded something that Martini had written and just immersed myself in Martini's writings. And that was the first moment where it clicked for me that some of the confusing things that we were seeing in this pontificate, they had a backstory. And I just became completely fixated on trying to find that backstory and figure out who the St Gallen Mafia members really were.
I like what Dr. Janet Smith said about the book, quote, "Our times abound in conspiracy theories. Here the conspirators themselves acknowledge the machinations and goals of the St Gallen self-identified mafia that collaborated to have Bergoglio elected Pope to implement a plan to change the church," end of quote. But let's start even a bit further back with the founding of the St Gallen Mafia. You write that the 5 cardinals who make up the group first got together in 1996 at the prompting of Cardinal Martini, specifically to form an opposition to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, future Pope Benedict XVI. At the time, he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Pope John Paul II. Why were these 5 cardinals so set against Ratzinger in 1996?
I think they really saw him as the flag bearer for the conservative restoration movement. He was the most prominent name in that direction, and he had fought against some of their different proposals. We talked about communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, and he had shut down that proposal in 1994 through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, when 2 of the members, Carl Lehman and Walter Casper, had proposed it in 1993. So he was certainly the glue for the group in terms of the man that they were opposing, the program that they were opposing. And the biography of one of the members, Cardinal Godfrey Daniels, talks about how they had other things that they would talk about as well. So they would talk about homosexuality, especially around the year after the year 2000. They talked about decentralizing the church. They talked about women deaconesses. At various points, they talked about the ordination of married men. So a lot of the agenda that is currently on the progressive side of the church, it was really discussed years before by this group.
And truly, that's what they had in common. It was their infidelity to Jesus and his Catholic Church in matters of faith and morals. For instance, they were all dissenters against Humanae Vitae. We can call them Modernists, Progressives, global leftists. They all fit. And these cardinals came together in their so-called mafia to wage war on Ratzinger, but ultimately it was to wage war on Jesus and his Catholic Church. For me, that's one of the strongest takeaways in the book, that we need to get fortified in the authoritative teachings of Jesus and his Catholic Church on faith and morals, and be on guard, especially for those prelates within the church who are wrongly working to try to water down and change those authoritative teachings. We must be aware and clear-eyed on the fact that the dictatorship of relativism has infiltrated much of the human leadership of the church. And this is also what we need to teach our children. We need to guard them from the wolves as they grow up and teach them how to be on guard and detect those wolves for themselves and for their children. Pope Benedict tells it to us himself this way in his 2020 book, which you quote in your book, written with Cardinal Sarah. Pope Benedict says this, quote, "On every side, the waves of relativism are submerging the bark of the church," end of quote. You weave this thread throughout your book, the dictatorship of relativism. It's what Ratzinger was against, and really what this mafia embraced. Anything more on that thread of the dictatorship of relativism?
It's a huge theme. Of course, Ratzinger, he gave that famous speech about the dictatorship of relativism shortly before he was elected in 2005. It was at that pre-conclave mass that he gave this speech. And it was just such an eloquent battle cry, such an eloquent center of gravity for us to focus on. And I think that his pontificate, you see him in various ways, of course, trying to fight the dictatorship of relativism and having this group of modernists warring against him. The first half of my book is actually called War, precisely to talk about this war that was against Pope Benedict. For those who haven't read the book, it comes from, there was a member named Achilles Silvestrini, and someone ran into him the night that Pope Benedict was elected. And this cardinal who ran into him said that Silvestrini looked defeated, and he looked like he was declaring a form of war against Pope Benedict. So they really, as the book details, they really made life very hard for Pope Benedict, just with the dissent. Martini, who I talked about before, he had some very high level moments of dissent where Benedict would say something and then he would undercut it almost immediately afterwards. So I think that this is a struggle that was all too real, and it's a struggle that we have to take sides, and we have to do our efforts in our own vocation, to try to fight the dictatorship of relativism.
What else do you want to share with us from that opening section on war that really jumps out to you as maybe a story or a detail that can help make it all more clear to us?
There was a kind of multi-pronged war against him, and each mafia member had kind of a front that he was in charge of. So Cardinal Daniels was attacking Humanae Vitae. Martini wanted a new council, kind of like a Vatican III. Casper wanted more local control for churches, communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. So it was a very complicated, multi-pronged war. I think that's important to remember.
I want to dive into that a bit more. In the 2005 conclave, these cardinals opposed Ratzinger, but then when it became clear that the votes were swinging his way and his election was inevitable, then it seems that they immediately befriended him and tried to influence him, while at the same time, behind his back, they continued to carry out their war against him with various attacks. You spoke about this a little bit in the first segment. What more can you tell us about this, specifically this tactic that they seemed to try to change course with during the conclave, when it seemed like things were turning where he was going to be inevitable, and then they tried to befriend him?
The theory behind this seems to be that Ratzinger, the conclave dynamics, basically, he had crossed a certain threshold where if his supporters held out and didn't blink, basically there would be no blocking him. There would be no compromise candidate. But there was this notion that Ratzinger probably, he didn't really want to be Pope, as far as we can tell. So there was this concern that maybe if this game went on too long, he would just bow out, and he would want Cardinal Camillo Ruini to be Pope. So the theory is that essentially Martini, the leader of the St Gallen Mafia, did not want Ruini to be Pope, and thought that Ratzinger would be kind of friendlier to him. And so I've looked at so many different sources that say that he gave the green light for Ratzinger to win, and Ratzinger, he won. It was one of the fastest elections of modern papal history. So I think that we're on pretty solid ground on that sort of theory of what happened, as far as I can tell. But he had this cryptic saying where he said to expect beautiful surprises from Ratzinger. It's so kind of eerie. I mean, what did he know? What sort of surprises were we to expect from Ratzinger? Did he know that maybe was Ratzinger already thinking about stepping down at some point independently? And did he know could he sense that? We don't know for sure. That's one possibility. That's something that has crossed different people's minds. But in any case, they wanted him to be a transitional pope. So they were starting this war against him, and I think they knew that he had a potential Achilles heel, which is the fact that he had been speaking for multiple years about how sometimes it is right for a pope to resign, and he had, of course, seen what happened with John Paul II and his slow decline from Parkinson's disease. So I think that they knew how to make life very, very difficult for him.
Also, in reading the book, there were times where Pope John Paul II or Pope Benedict XVI, they seemed to catch on to some of these cardinals, and they took proper action against them, sometimes very firmly. But it also seems that they both made some big mistakes in letting some of these guys hang around and have great influence. For example, Cardinal Silvestrini, he was one of the last people to see John Paul II before he died, as you relate in your book. And then just 3 days after he died, Silvestrini was inviting Martini and the Mafia to get together for their anti-Ratzinger plotting session. And then Martini is with Benedict in June 2021, looking him in the eye and telling him, "You have no choice but to leave. The time is now," meaning for resignation. These men were able to hang around when they ought to have been exiled for the poison that they were pushing. And it seemed that they had some great influence because of that. What are your thoughts?
It's an enigma. I think that with hindsight, we can look back and see that there were a lot of very bad appointments that were made under, some of these popes, and it's very hard to know how much were they in the dark about what was really going on. How much did they let the wolves? I mean, Benedict had that statement about not wanting to flee for fear of the wolves. Pray for me. And yet, he let Martini meet with him so often. That was kind of one of the surprising parts of researching this book, seeing the meetings that Martini was having with Ratzinger, and he was boasting about it to a confidant that he was having these private meetings with Benedict. And then he was saying things like, "I hope that Benedict resigns soon," as if he knew something, as if maybe Benedict was already talking about resigning and talking about it perhaps, to Martini as well. And then as you said, Martini did tell Benedict to resign in 2012 in June. So it's, as a writer, I sort of practice a kind of restraint on this, where I report as many facts and put as many pieces of the puzzle together as I can, but I kind of let the reader deduce or ask questions about, what may have been going on here. Or, I think we need further research into this. And I think just recently, 1 Peter 5, where I often write for, they published something by the great historian Roberto de Mattei. And he's been shedding light on Silvestrini in particular, and a sort of gang that was operating in the Vatican, so to speak, before the St Gallen Mafia. And I think that may go a long way toward explaining some of these confusing elevations that we see here.
Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, obviously they were in the dark on quite a bit. They were deceived in various areas. They had these wolves all around them. And so, looking back on it, you can see what happens when you're not able to detect those wolves. Very bad things can take place. And so all the more reason for us to make sure this stuff is getting to the light and everybody can see it. And you do a great job laying it out. But they even tried to mount public pressure to get Pope John Paul II out, didn't they? So that they could elect Martini as Pope. There are facts that lead us into that direction as well, aren't there?
Around the year 2000, they had this interesting kind of series of trial balloons where they would talk about in the media, several cardinals from the St Gallen Mafia would talk about how Pope John Paul II was allegedly planning to resign in the year 2000. And he had allegedly tried to make it to the year 2000, but then he was going to be ready to abdicate. And they were trial balloons, so they were supposed to effect what they floated, what they raised. They were trying to accomplish the very idea that they were floating, and they didn't work. But it just it's very eerie, because when you look at that pattern that they were trying this in the year 2000 already with John Paul II, and then you think about what ultimately happened with Benedict resigning. Again, it raises many questions, and some of it we just don't know the answers. We can only speculate, but at least we can kind of pose the question that they seem to have been very, very fixated on papal succession. And at first, as you said, they wanted Martini. He was the one, and then he got sick with Parkinson's disease. So eventually they realized that it wouldn't be Martini that they would get.
Yeah. One of my favorite parts of the book, as far as being most helpful in really understanding the history and the common thread here that goes from all the way back to Jesuit priest Father Karl Rahner. I would say this is a line of infidelity that you connect from Karl Rahner through Martini to Bergoglio. What do you see as that common thread? I know Professor de Mattei, he did describe this as Pope Francis is the true revolutionary, even truer than Rahner, because Rahner was a dreamer and a thinker, and Bergoglio actually does things. But how do you explain this thread for us so that we can see it clearly?
So Rahner, after the Second Vatican Council, he wrote this book called The Shape of the Church to Come. And the idea was basically how do we shape the post-conciliar church? And the ideas that he came up with, they're going to sound very familiar, are things like communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, ordination of married men, synodality, etc. So essentially it gets passed on to Martini and then to Bergoglio, and Bergoglio is kind of the one to implement. what Rahner had dreamed of.
Julia, what is the dream, the playbook, the goals that are now culminating in Pope Francis's pontificate?
That's such an important question. And in 1999, Martini actually, he got up at a synod and he said that he had a dream, and he was alluding to one of his friends who was also a one-time mafia member, Basil Hume. And Hume had spoken in 1980 about having a dream. And now Martini was saying that he had a dream, and it was to address a bunch of different knots, KNOTS, that were doctrinal and disciplinary. And he spoke kind of in code, but looking back on it, we go back to, basically he was speaking of communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, ordination of married men, ordination of deaconesses, new approach to sexuality. These were the dreams. It wasn't just one issue, it was a series of issues. And he kept coming back to it. He had an interview with Eugenio Scalfari, a famous atheist from La Repubblica newspaper in Italy. And essentially, he told Scalfari asked him, what are the most important issues in order? And Martini, this is around 2008 or 2009, he says the divorced is the number one issue. And the number two issue is the appointment of bishops. And the number three issue is priestly celibacy. So when we hear the dream articulated in this way, and another way of putting the dream is synodality, the idea of using synods, a series of synods to revolutionize the church, essentially. And instead of having a big council, because Martini, he had wanted a council, but a kind of Vatican III. And at some point, he realized, probably with input from other St. Gallen Mafia members, that wasn't very viable, and that it would be better and more practical to use synods as a vehicle for change. And so, of course, this is going to sound very familiar in the pontificate of Pope Francis, because we did have the very contentious family synods that were discussing the Casper proposal, named after Walter Casper of the Mafia, for communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. So Martini said he wanted something on the divorce. That was his number one dream, a synod on the divorce. And he got it in this pontificate. That was one of the very first things that happened in this pontificate.
Based on all of that, what do you think we ought to be looking for in terms of upcoming moves that perhaps Pope Francis would make based on this dream, this plan, this playbook that has been kind of handed on to him in a sense?
So definitely, we'll be watching the synod on synodality. I think it remains to be seen what exactly, if they have a specific agenda besides just reinforcing synodality and making this kind of a permanent revolutionary process. The second thing to watch is, of course, what's going to happen with the moves against the traditional Latin Mass. Traditionis Custodes, the motu proprio against the Latin Mass that abrogated Summorum Pontificum, which Benedict XVI had promulgated to liberalize the use of the Latin Mass. Traditionis Custodes came out literally probably 2 weeks after I finished editing my book. So there's nothing specifically in the book about the traditional Latin Mass, but after the book was, just getting in the process of being published, I did write some articles at 1 Peter 5 about Traditionis Custodes and about how the Mafia, they even had their hands in this issue of the Latin Mass. So I talk about how one of the members, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, some of the things that he did, and one of his proteges is Arthur Roche, who is a new leader for the Congregation for the Doctrine of Worship under Pope Francis. So he was specifically picked by Pope Francis, and he has this history with Murphy O'Connor fighting against Summorum Pontificum. Basically, the two of them were misrepresenting Summorum Pontificum when it came out and trying to limit its ability to let people, participate in the traditional Latin Mass. So I think that these new developments, the synodality development and then the Traditionis Custodes development, they're very, very worrisome and definitely, something that we're going to have to keep our eyes on.
I want to bring it back to what you call in the book a revolutionary process culminating in Francis's pontificate, and McCarrick even emerges in here as he's enlisted to talk up Bergoglio just ahead of the 2013 pre-conclave meetings. These cardinals pushed for Bergoglio, there's no doubt about it. As the reader learns more and more details in the book about that push, it does beg the question as to whether it's all permissible, yet you make that clear on page 105 that none of it would invalidate Pope Francis's election. But at the same time, according to the words of Mafia member Murphy O'Connor, who said, quote, "I think that when the cardinals elected Bergoglio, they did not know what a Pandora's box they were opening. They did not know that he was a Jesuit in very deep ways. They did not know who they were electing," end of quote. Your thought on, as you look at the details of the way that he was pushed, again, you're not making the case in any way that this invalidates his pontificate, but what do you walk away with from it all?
One piece of the puzzle I would add here is just the level of activity that was happening in 2012 is really staggering, coming from this group, because in 2012, Martini and Daniels and some other Mafia members, they actually met in April of 2012 at or near St Gallen, Switzerland. And this is 6 years after Daniels's biographers said they stopped meeting. So for years, we have been told that this group broke up around 2006, that we didn't hear a peep from them, at any point afterwards. And then we hear that they were meeting in April 2012, and there's actually a new book, and my understanding is it has a testimony from someone who was at that meeting and who was friends with Martini, just verifying again that Martini really was there in 2012. So I think that around 2012, Casper was also talking about a southerly wind. This is something that my colleague Micah Hickson pointed out to me, and this was later used to talk about Bergoglio. So if they had their eye on Bergoglio in 2012 and everything, there was so much calculation going on here. As you said, as I say in my book, I've looked at this from different angles, and the canon lawyers who seem most reputable on this issue have suggested that this does not invalidate the election. So my position in the book is not in any way challenging the validity of Pope Francis's election, but for the historical record, I think it's important for us to see how much calculation went into getting him elected.
Was that a helpful video for you? I sure hope so. That's why we do this show, to help real people get real results, advancing in the way, the truth, and the life that we're made for. It's called The Simple Truth. It's a radio program Monday through Friday, and we live stream it right here on this channel. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share if you would be so kind. And if you like that last video, here's another one I think you might get a lot out of.